All right, welcome to the WP crowd. Another awesome episode. Um, Today we're talking about WordPress security, how to fix a hack site, how to prevent a hack site, and some other cool tips. Before we get into it, I'm going to start with introductions. I'm going to start with my left. So, Chris, why don't you go first?
I'm Chris Wigman. I'm a senior web engineer for 10up. Originally, before this, I was the builder of the Better WP Security plugin, which I sold to iThemes. It's now iThemes Security.
Awesome. Marco?
I'm Mark Heijn. I'm from the Netherlands. Last year I still worked at hosting company 101, and now I restarted my own agency, Code Kitchen.
Very cool. And Michelle?
Hi, I'm Michelle. I am from Southern Illinois. I do support for Yoast and Give WP, and I'm also a security specialist with WP Security Law.
Cool, and as usual, I am Roy. I'm a WordPress developer at Disney, and I also run the CodeCavalry.com, where you can get WordPress code help. I would just like to start this episode by ranting a little bit about Amazon, because I love Amazon Prime specifically. They always tell me when I'm going to get my products, and they always come on time, except for when I actually really need something, like a microphone. And it doesn't come on time, but everything else does. Just the microphone didn't come on time. So, unlike most podcasts where I have a nice microphone set up, I returned my old mic to try a new one, and it was supposed to come 2 days ago, but Amazon didn't deliver. So, Amazon, if you're listening, it is not February 3rd anymore. You can. I didn't get my package. Please, bring it.
Does anybody know what he said? I can't hear him.
All right, so today we're talking about security, and so it kind of started. I mean, security has always been a big thing with WordPress. Honestly, the only real reason I brought it up this week was because late last week I got a client who was like, "Hey, my WordPress site was hacked. What can you fix it? What can I do?" And I mean, it was like all kinds of hacked, and Google was, they had that malicious code warning thing going on, so you couldn't even go see the site. I was like, you know what, we should talk about this, because, it's never been talked about before.
For the record, Roy was talking before the show how he doesn't worry about security, so there's a little more to this story.
So it is true. While I code for security purposes in my day job, as long as you're not doing something really dumb with your code, and I think we can get into code stuff a little bit later. For the most part, we have our huge security team. We have our server teams. Everyone has, our hosting team, stuff like that. For me personally, those are enough layers of security for me. I personally also run WordFence on my site, so that is the last layer. So yeah, I mean, I think about it. I don't really, I don't have nightmares about it or anything. So let's start with the first kind of thing where most people don't really care about security until the ultimate WordPress site hacking. The WordPress site is now run by ISIS, and they need to know how to fix it. I'm gonna just turn to Michelle because she did an awesome job helping me out with my client site. So Michelle, what is your step-by-step process for getting into a hack site and fixing it, just getting it back up and running, whether it's duct taped together or what, but just up and running again?
The best thing to do is to take all the code from the file manager, make a zip, download it, and go through it on your desk. And with that, I have Kaspersky running on my Mac, and when it comes to the really nasty files, it will growl at me and tell me which ones need to be deleted. Go through every single file, make sure all the nasty code is deleted, and then push up clean files. If you got clean copies of themes and plugins, use those instead of having to manually go through it. And make sure every little bit is gone, and make sure all the plugins, themes, and core is up to date before you try to go back live again.
So you said you delete all the nasty code, I think was what your exact quote was. How do you know what is a nasty code? Do you have another tool for that, or Do you have do you just know what you're looking for? Like, how do you know what makes up nasty code?
One of the first things you see is with the file name. Like if it's .zx23 and no extension on it, and a lot of times the files will look weird. Sorry, my cat just decided to open up the door and come on in and join us. Another thing is base64 encode. That's a big trigger because 98% of files won't be using base64. There are a few I've seen with it in there, and it's supposed to be. And just reading through the code and seeing, like, saying if it's going to try to open up another server somewhere else, try to get your server information on a weird named code file.
All right. How about Marco or Chris? Do you guys have any tips for sites already been hacked? What are some good tips for getting it back up and running, cleaned up and stuff like that? Any tools you guys have, or what are some steps you guys take?
Go ahead, Marco.
Personally, I had it like last year when my site almost got hacked, and basically what I was looking first was like the log files. Like I knew which files were added, and just searching and see what were the steps, how they were able to upload the files there, and from there I was like I could see, okay, what was the cause of the hack. It was simply because a premium plugin was not updated that one, and made additional steps that even if a PHP file got in the upload directory, that it's still not able to execute. Also, I started doing some, like, wrote a little plugin on what I run on my own laptop that just checks if there are PHP files added on my upload directory, and try to do some small scans on my own. So when I first saw it was hacked, I also started looking, okay, what I can personally do to see it next time faster than I currently did, because I just got notified with 101 that I got a mail like, well, roughly a few hundred customers got like issues, and with this plugin, it was like, I have that plugin, and I started testing it out, and I was able to hack my website. I was like, well, probably I should look into it. So in my case, I was lucky because I was working at a company like that. Not anymore, so I need better tools to see if my website is hacked or not.
Yeah, me it's a little bit easier. I don't worry so much about if it has been or not. I mean, most of the cleanups I get, it's pretty apparent. As far as tools, it's not so much about the tools to clean them. I don't even try, unless it's a custom theme that actually absolutely has to be cleaned up, or a plugin that has to be cleaned itself, everything's replaced. No exceptions. Hopefully they have a database backup for that part, because, I mean, there's two very big distinct parts here, too. We have to divide what we're talking about, replacing files or cleaning files versus database issues. Most of the hacks that are happening with WordPress, of course, are file and not database. There's exceptions to every rule. But in the case of the file stuff, too, I just want to make sure that we know it's, cleaning a site is one nomenclature, but cleaning the files is probably the wrong way to say it, because you shouldn't be taking code. If it's a core file, you should never try editing it to clean it. You should just be replaced. The whole WP includes just about everything in your WP content folder. All that stuff can be replaced real easy. Then the only thing you really need to scan is just uploads, just to make sure that there's not some sort of backdoor that can be hit or something else like that. It's a little bit different view. Sorry.
Yeah. So before we get into preventative measures, maybe for people who are watching or will be watching later, or people that are just getting into this, I know this is not that much of an issue now. We were kind of talking about this pre-show where, WordPress hosts or host companies in general are more keen to this kind of stuff. But I remember back in the day, even on my first DreamHost account, I'd get hacked quite a bit. So I'm kind of curious if you guys have a good explanation that's pretty layman's on how does someone's code get modified to begin with? Like PHP code is server side, right? So it's living on the server. From an entry-level developer point of view, the only way to modify a PHP file is to go into the through FTP and edit it. So how are they getting the base 64 code in? How are they getting that kind of stuff in? Is there like a simple explanation for all of that?
Most of the time, it's typically a plugin or theme that has not been updated. A vulnerability was found and then exploited.
I'll just expand on that. A lot of times these vulnerabilities are using things either they're saving to the file system. For instance, if you do an upload, a file upload through, Roy Simmons' form plugin that he didn't have the security guys review, and it takes, it takes, you only want images uploaded, just hypothetically. So you set it so, okay, just check the file name. If it's .jpeg, save it to the hard drive, and because it's images, you're usually doing temp things and so on and so forth. If that's not closed off right, if that's not sanitized right, you're not actually really checking the file. All you do is say, oh, whatever you're sending me has a extension of .jpg, I can save it to the drive. So you switch the file name, you switch something else to a .php extension, or there you get something executable on the server. You change a PHP to a JPEG. There's other ways with these forms, especially if they're writing and moving files around the file system. The methods are already there, so they can be accessed. For instance, file put contents, file get contents, fwrite, fopen, all those types of different things. If they're accessible to the end user via a form interface, how else are they accessible to that end user? How can that form interface be manipulated to make those form fields accessible to do things that the original developer did not intend? And that's how a lot of this stuff happens. That's where you're finding. That's how plugins become vulnerable. That's how themes become vulnerable. That's how a lot of core vulnerabilities happen. It's in unintended consequences of enforcement of different validation, sanitization in many cases. That's the root result, or that's the root cause of a lot of where these vulnerabilities, a lot of where these hacks come from.
Yeah, it's partly that, but it's also still just by logging into WordPress and using the editor. Like, I think it was like a year or two ago that I basically saw that people could hack. They knew the credentials of WordPress, could log in, go to the plugin, enable one of the default plugins like Akismet or Hello Dolly, and just add that one because it's always there. That's the reason why hosting companies delete Hello Dolly and also start disabling the editor by default, because it's a pretty decent amount of people who get hacked through the default functionality of WordPress itself.
Yeah, I always find that interesting because, as a developer, yeah, I try to think again. I try to think of security all the time. I don't use things like encoding, for anything. But you never know. Like there's these hackers out there that are keen to these kind of things. They're quick to find, the bugs in your code, or I don't say the bugs, but the vulnerabilities of. All right, well, he has a form that's on the front end. It's passing data into the back end. And saving a file, there's a way to get into that, and I think a lot of developers, especially ones that are just starting, are kind of expecting WordPress to handle a lot of that, but WordPress doesn't always by core default handle every single use case. I know that again it's getting better, and that's why these big security patches are always brought out and automatically updated across all your WordPress sites, but you can't catch everything, especially as code is evolving and new versions of code are coming out. So from a developer point of view, it is interesting, and I would say every developer should take note onto what they're doing, and never assume that WordPress itself is going to handle all your security issues, because it's not. Was it IE is notorious for, or used to be notorious for having a lot of security holes too, so. Just like that. All right, so let's say you got your hack site, now you've got it fixed, it's good to go, you're up and running again, Google's not giving you a warning. Let's talk about preventative measures. So I already have a site, and sometimes it's not even your site's been hacked, but in cases like where I work or other enterprise, it's the matter of fact that you have a website now is getting thousands upon thousands of visits a day, right? So you're getting so much traffic and you're such a popular site that hackers are just keen to, try to attack you. So you really want as much preventative measures as possible. So let's say you're not on some corporate, super high-end enterprise level hosting. You're on a decent, maybe a VPS or even a shared hosting. What are some preventative things that you can do with your WordPress site? Michelle, I think you had a plugin that you installed, so what does that do and how does it help?
With Hello Security, it's made in the style of Hello Dolly that will give different security tips in your admin dashboard of like remembering to use secure passwords, remembering to update your plugins and themes when it comes up, and different little tips like that. But the biggest thing is updating.
How about you, Marco? Do you have any preventative measures for, let's say your site again has been hacked, not hacked, whatever, but to prevent it from being hacked? What do you do?
Not that much currently. Like I limit my login for the admin use, super admin, that it only can be from certain IPs, just through a WordPress plugin, because then I can check the roles. So if you're like subscriber or just writing blog posts, you can still log in wherever you are, except I need to use a VPN. I use mod security, but still on minimum level. Like for most people, probably going on a shared hosting is more secure than go to a VPS, because on a VPS you need to do all your things yourself. But on host already does some stuff yourself. Like I would not ever rename my WP login, because it generally makes you um, less secure, because the host will not prevent that. Like I know I worked for 101 before, and they had logic in place. If you went 3 times in 1 minute, for example, to WP login and tried to log in, you were not able to log in for 1 minute, for example. And all those measurements are needed. Like, and if you have that in place, for most of the cases you're pretty safe. Like obviously the popular plugins not, but personally I always rather do it like on a server level, because if you manage a lot of sites, especially if you're a set host, then preventing that on one location for like say that issue with Jetpack like a year or two ago, where basically hosts are just blocking all access to the Jetpack point except from certain IPs. And a lot of hosts or shared hosts do that. So if you're a shared host, you're fine. If you're on VPS, you need to do way more yourself. And in this case, most of the time, just update the plugins and themes, and in generally, you're fine.
Yeah, one thing I heard, I'm not sure how true this is, but one thing that someone mentioned, I don't remember where, some Facebook group probably, was that because the brute force attempts, which is basically, let me go to the login screen and have a program that runs and tries to essentially log in with anything possible, and then, try all these password combinations until it finally gets one, which usually doesn't, but sometimes they're lucky. One thing I was looking at was, or someone mentioned, was that if you change if you have PHP-MyAdmin or database access, you change the user ID of the admin, because usually by default WordPress makes them ID 1. So if someone's smart enough, they can try to figure out at least the username of user ID 1, whether it's admin or some other concoction. And again, I always recommend not leaving admin as your admin username when you're signing up or creating your WordPress site. Try to change it to something else. But let's say it is admin. Finding user ID, the user ID for the username for user ID 1 is, and it just automatically being the admin, the very first user, makes it a little too easy. So I've heard a lot of people that they do the switch. Well, they'll change it to like something like 100 or something, or some other random number, and that way just makes it that much harder. Have you guys done that? Is there any real value to doing something like that?
That's pretty irrelevant these days. Author archives, unless you've completely disabled author archives or changed the nice name, your username appears in the URL anyway of the author archives. All you got to do is browse all the authors, and you get almost all the usernames on 90% of sites.
Yeah, but if you have a unique, let's say you're smart enough to not use admin as your main username, theoretically, even if you're looking through the author archives, you wouldn't know which one's an administrator, would you?
Doesn't really matter. You log in once, you have all the usernames.
The thing is, it becomes more tricky for script kiddies. But even in my site, if I have my username admin and password admin, no one is able to log in because they need to have also the IP. So especially if you have two-factor authentication, you always have like a two-factor, in my case IP, that helps you out. So that's mainly the key point in making your site secure, like changing your username, changing your user ID doesn't make sense because in the end, the brute force is the main problem. That's what should be prevented. If that is prevented, then all the other steps are less needed anyway.
Yeah, the one thing I do like about WordFence is on sites like Code Cavalry where I have it running. People, I get a lot. I don't get a lot, but every so often I'll get an email and it'll show me, hey, someone tried to log in, 17 times in 30 seconds using the, admin as the username, and then it'll block that IP by default from going forward. It'll tell me where in the world that IP was located, what username, and then how many attempts they failed in what amount of time. So one of the things I do like about WordFence, it does have that login fail-safe attempt thing. There's other plugins that do that as well. WordFence, obviously being I think it's a freemium plugin. I just have the pro version. I think there's actually a plugin called Login Attempts, which allows you to switch how many times, so like 3 or 5 or whatever.
I think security does the same, where it allows you to choose all that and everything.
Yeah.
The standalone limit logins.
Yeah. There's so many of those. But even that, though, just like Mark was saying, it's not necessarily a redundant plugin if you can avoid it. And if you're shared hosting, your host probably is taking care of this for you on the server level. If you're not shared hosting your VPS, there's almost no reason not to use fail-to-ban or something similar where you let the server take care of it for you. It's so much less resource intensive. I mean, it really makes a big difference on performance.
That's the whole point, yeah.
I think a lot of the problem is a lot of people that are getting hacked are on shared hosting, which has its own kind of security issues. But again, hosting, and we've kind of talked about this before, is hosting's come a long way in the past 5-6 years when it comes to security. So I mean, so is WordPress core, but everything's evolving, code's evolving. So when PHP 5.7 finally becomes PHP 7 finally becomes the what WordPress uses by default, it's going to have its own whole slew of security vulnerabilities that we don't know about yet. So I do recommend obviously talking to your host provider, getting your host to do as much as possible they can for security. A lot of hosts will actually sweep your code as well. DreamHost does this. I'm pretty sure they will actually create a quarantine of your site separate from your live site, and they will quarantine out all of your infected files, which is pretty cool. Sometimes, I'm not sure if they'll clean up and then, obviously have your site running with clean files, but I think that at least they'll do is quarantine, because I know in the past I will FTP in and they'll be like my site and then like quarantine my site, which is same thing, just again quarantined files that they found to be infected with something. And I think a lot of newer hosts do this, especially WordPress hosts that are focused on the WordPress build. I'm sure WP Engine has their own security built into it for that kind of stuff as well. One last question I wanted to run through, and this is kind of a interesting question that kind of keeps on popping up, is as a developer, are there any pieces of code functionality that you should just avoid at all costs because they by default are bad for security? So I'm going to give you one example that I know of, and I know that using like base64 encoding is a bad idea. Whether it's JavaScript or PHP, it's just you shouldn't be doing it. But I've always found it interesting to learn what else is out there. So do you guys have any other ones that, as a plugin developer, as a theme developer, just no, stay away from this function or stay away from this piece of code?
I've actually given a whole talk on this. I'm trying to remember all the ones I used as a demonstration. This was my Loop conference talk, and this is another talk I'm giving here just in 2 weeks at WordCamp Miami. See if I can remember all the ones I listed specifically, because I can go on all day on specifics. But yeah, the catch is with WordPress, you should be using the APIs provided, is really what it comes down to. What happens with people is things like validation, trying to validate URLs with standard, filter var. It doesn't care what the schema is, so you can put FTP :// You could put JavaScript :// Its URL validator is bad. There's all sorts of. Sorry, I'm still trying to come up with the link here so Roy can put it out there. I guess I'm doing this backwards. But there's all sorts of different ones. Writing to eval, writing to if you're not good with pred replace, getting things to eval. Create function if you don't know how it works. Including dynamic files. People try to write their own autoloaders all the time. That's kind of a dangerous one, even if you consider the file editor. If you have your own autoloader in the theme and you get to the file editor, you're going to get that thing to load whatever you want. File get contents. Turning off things like SSL validation when you're doing dev. That's a really big one that you see all the time, because until Let's Encrypt, we would have to pay for certificates on dev. So if you want to test on dev, disable SSL validation, and then push it live and leave it disabled. Site's wide open to man in the middle at that point. But there's all sorts of functions in PHP that largely are combated just by using WordPress APIs.
Yeah, I know another one that we take into consideration a lot is when you have forms that are on the front end that you're going to pass something to the back end. Don't ever assume an input field is going to be a valid input string. Validate whatever you can against whatever input, because you should never ever trust the users of your website. Just a kind of thing that we do. So we try to validate everything we can, especially if it's like we're asking for a URL or something. We validate against that. Any other text area, stuff like that, we again, WordPress has a lot of this stuff, the sanitized text already built in, or at least functions for it, which is pretty cool. But yeah, never just assume that what a user is going to just input into a form field can go straight into like your database or a file on your system.
Even with the translations, I think it's interesting you brought that up in some of the APIs. Misusing translatable functions. Just double underscore or underscore e. Clap press, Marco. I'm sure you've seen this, but instead of escape HTML, we've seen translation files with scripts embedded, because that'll just echo out whatever is put back in as that translation. But even little things like that, as far as watching your code, not just validating URLs and normal user input, validating things like what your translators are giving you and stuff like that is just as important.
Yeah, that's more the uncommon one. People expect that, well, translation files are always secure, so escaping is generally not needed. And maybe they only do it like if it's in HTML because of as an attribute to HTML, something that they will escape it. But generally they just don't do it. Another one I think also like a year or two issue was like serialized data that people did not expect. Well, it can be a security issue, and it can basically initialize code that was like added in the database, what made it insecure, and then if you inserialize it, it will perform the code without you even able to check it out. So there's a lot of things that even WordPress uses, but can become insecure on the moment. Well, if you don't check the data before you inserialize and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of things people should know.
Unserialize is a good point, because it'll run the constructor. It'll also run the wake method upon instantiation, upon that unserialized. There's a couple of applications out that transport and serialized data, and the biggest check they do is they look for a string within that serialized string. Boy, that's easy to overcome if you want. As soon as you run unserialized, run whatever you want.
Yeah.
Even the WordPress API for like getting the plugins and getting the themes is still using serialized data because of some incompatibility if they move to JSON. So it's also especially for WordPress, in this case, it's also pretty hard to even make the change because they want to, but there's like still like, how can we do it?
Well, updating WordPress to be better is a whole nother conversation. one that we've had in the past already, but I don't really want to get into that right now because we're about out of time. So really interesting stuff. I'm still learning about security as I go. Obviously, whether it's bad code or, and the thing is, if you're just doing like normal things, I guess. Like I don't unless you're doing something I think pretty advanced. I find myself not needing to always know about this kind of code security stuff because as Chris or anyone else says, don't use this, don't use this. I'm like, I never use it anyway. Like it doesn't come up in my day-to-day programming anyway. But I picked up early, escaping string stuff like that, and that's just part of my default way to code nowadays. So, obviously usually not in my V1. So I'm sorry if you happen to see a work in progress on GitHub and it's not escaped. I usually don't publish stuff into like the main repo, the org repo, until I've done stuff like that. But I like to open source and push stuff as I code. So sometimes I do miss stuff. That's about it for today. Awesome talk about security. I've learned more stuff today, as I do usually when I talk about security with people.
If you're listening to this, though, make sure you go out to Roy's GitHubs and give a security review on his code.
Yes, and feel free to security audit my code and pull and fork it and make it better, and then pull request anything you want. Obviously, anything on GitHub is a work in progress, so feel free.
Just make sure they all say "Hi, Roy" somewhere in them.
Such a troll. Anyway, thank you all for joining us. I will see you guys next week. Again, Friday, our new time. I actually woke up on time today, unlike last week, so I'm pretty excited. I'm happy. Hopefully next week I'll have my microphone too, so I will sound a little bit better than this thing. Thank you guys for joining us.